Her name was Tameisha Price. She was just 34 years old, glowing with the anticipation of motherhood. In only a few weeks she was set to welcome her baby girl, a child she already named Tameisha Price. But instead of a celebration, her life was brutally cut short by the very man she trusted most. On the night of January 24, 2024, the quiet streets of Toledo, Ohio, became the scene of a chilling conspiracy. A young mother 8 months pregnant would never live to hold her child. Behind the trigger, the father of her unborn baby Paris James and his close friend Jerry Scott. And in the shadows, another figure, Chatouilla Triplet, would weave lies to shield the killers from justice. But why? Why would a man plot against the mother of his child? Police records and courtroom testimony revealed a twisted motive. Paris claimed he doubted the baby was his. He didn't want another child. He didn't want child support. And instead of walking away, he chose murder. This is the story of betrayal, of silence, and of how the people closest to us can become our greatest danger. But before we unravel this chilling crime, ask yourself this: how many stories like Tameisha's go untold? How many voices are silenced forever? You're watching Unraveling Crimes. Subscribe right now, because if you don't, stories like this will continue to unfold in silence, and you'll be left in the dark when the truth is revealed. And if you think you can just click away, ask yourself, do you really want to live blind to the truth? Stay with me as we go back to the beginning. To understand how Tameisha's life ended so tragically, we must first understand who she was, and the people she trusted most. Before the headlines, before the courtroom battles, before the betrayal came to light, there was simply Tameisha Price. Born and raised in Toledo, Ohio, Tameisha was known for her radiant smile, her sense of humor, and her deep love for her family. Friends called her Misha. She was the kind of person who could walk into a room and instantly make people feel welcome. She was only 34 years old, but those who knew her said she carried the wisdom and strength of someone who had endured much. And yet she never let life's struggles harden her heart. Instead, she poured her energy into her loved ones. Family meant everything to her. In late 2023, she received the news that would bring her the greatest joy. She was expecting a daughter. A baby girl she already named Tameisha Price. She decorated her home with little touches, preparing a space for her baby. She dreamed of tiny footsteps echoing across the floor, lullabies sung at night, and the laughter of her child filling the air. To her family, she was more than a daughter, more than a sister, more than a friend. She was hope. And Tameisha was the promise of a new beginning. Tameisha looked forward to embracing motherhood with open arms, and those who loved her celebrated alongside her, eagerly awaiting the day they'd meet the newest member of the family. But what Tameisha could not have known was that behind the smiles and promises, darkness was gathering. The very man connected to her unborn child was already drifting into suspicion, resentment, and rage. Instead of cherishing the life they created together, he would begin to see it as a burden. And for Tameisha, this love story was quietly, tragically transformed into a death sentence. To truly understand how this story unfolded, we must now turn to the other players in her life, the people who would shape her fate in ways she never imagined. Every tragedy has its cast of characters. For Tameisha Price, 3 people would enter her life and change its course forever, each one playing a role in the betrayal that sealed her fate. First, there was Paris James, 35 years old. To outsiders, he was Tameisha's partner, the father of the child she carried. But beneath the surface, Paris wrestled with doubts and fears. He didn't want another child. He didn't want the weight of child support. And though he would publicly question whether Malaysia was truly his, what records later revealed is chilling. Paris's doubts were less about truth and more about responsibility he simply didn't want to bear. To Tameisha he was supposed to be a protector. Instead he was already becoming a threat. Asterisk. Next came Jerry Scott. At just 26 years old he was a close friend of Paris. Someone Paris trusted. But Jerry wasn't just a bystander in this unfolding story. He would become Paris's partner in planning and ultimately in execution. Together they whispered about a way out. A way to erase the problem instead of facing it. And in that quiet plotting, Jerry stepped out of the role of friend and into the role of conspirator. And then there was Tameisha Triplet, 34 years old. Jerry's girlfriend. She didn't pull a trigger. She didn't fire a shot. But when the time came she chose deception. She gave Jerry and Paris something they desperately needed, an alibi. A false story crafted to shield them from suspicion. In her own way she tightened the noose around justice, making investigators work harder, making the truth harder to find. Together these three names, Paris James, Jerry Scott, Tameisha Triplet, would weave themselves into Tameisha's story. Each with choices that carried consequences. Each with actions that led to a single devastating night in January. And here's the truth. Cases like this fade quickly from the headlines. Names are forgotten. Victims vanish into silence. Don't let that happen. Subscribe to Unraveling Crimes right now. Because if you can listen to Tameisha's story and move on without subscribing, ask yourself, why would you choose to forget her? The story of Tameisha and Terry Paris was no fairy tale. At first glance they looked like any other couple trying to make things work. But beneath the surface, cracks had already begun to spread. Paris wasn't ready to step into the role of a responsible father again. Another child meant more weight, more responsibility, and more money. When Tameisha discovered she was pregnant, what should have been a moment of joy quickly turned into a storm cloud hovering over her relationship. Paris began questioning the pregnancy, not just in whispers but in accusations. He told her he didn't believe the baby was his, that she must have been unfaithful. But deep down the truth was uglier. He didn't want the child at all. He feared the chains of child support, the pressure of accountability, and he saw escape not through honesty but through destruction. Those who knew Tameisha said she was strong-willed. She wasn't the type to cower in silence. She defended her unborn child, she defended her dignity. And that strength made her a target. Arguments grew sharper. Words cut like knives. The walls of her home echoed with tension. Tension that would later spiral into deadly intent. And as those disputes worsened, Paris began leaning on someone else, his close friend Jerry Scott. To the outside world, Jerry was just another man in the neighborhood. But behind closed doors his loyalty to Paris would take a sinister turn. It was Jerry who listened to Paris's growing resentment. It was Jerry who didn't push back when Paris spoke of ways out. Instead of being a voice of reason, Jerry became a willing accomplice. The days leading up to January 24th were filled with this toxic mix. Paris's desperation, Jerry's misguided loyalty, and Tameisha's determination to protect her child. Three forces pulling in different directions, until the inevitable moment when one choice would silence a life forever. But here's where the story takes its darkest shift, because this wasn't just about a man trying to avoid responsibility. This was about power, control, and a decision so cold it still chills anyone who hears it today. And before we take you deeper into that nightmarish moment, ask yourself this: how many stories like this happen in silence? How many lives end in violence because the truth is hidden until it's too late? If you don't subscribe to Unraveling Crimes, you may never hear the stories that shake communities to their core. Staying in the dark doesn't protect you, it blinds you. Don't let ignorance win. Click subscribe now, because missing stories like this means missing the truth the world needs to face. January 24, 2024. The day began like any other, but for Tameisha Price, it would be her last. By this point, Terry Paris had made up his mind. The arguments, the pressure, the looming thought of another child, it all fueled a decision so sinister, it's almost impossible to comprehend. Paris wasn't just rejecting fatherhood, he was plotting an escape through violence. And he wouldn't do it alone. His friend Jerry Scott stood by him. Not as a bystander. Not as a man who tried to stop the madness. But as an accomplice. Someone who would help carry out the unimaginable. In hushed conversations, the two men pieced together their plan. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't reckless. It was cold, deliberate, and calculated. Every word exchanged between them became another step toward Tameisha's fate. Tameisha had no idea. She carried herself as she always did, strong, protective of her children, trying to find stability in the chaos that Paris created. But behind her back, the walls were closing in. Jerry's role wasn't passive. He would be the second hand in the act, the shadow that helped Paris turn an argument into a killing. Meanwhile, another name would later surface: Chatouilla Triplet, Jerry's girlfriend. She wasn't in the room when the murder happened, but her role would emerge in the aftermath, crafting a false alibi to cover Jerry's tracks. Think about it. 3 adults tangled in a web of lies and deceit, circling around one woman whose only crime was wanting to live, to raise her children, and to protect the life growing inside her. That night, Paris and Jerry set the plan in motion. And as Tameisha walked unknowingly into her final moments, she couldn't have imagined that the man she once loved, the father of her child, would be the one orchestrating her death. And here's the part that chills you. This wasn't rage in the heat of the moment. This wasn't a mistake. This was a premeditated act. Planned, executed, concealed. And as you listen to this, remember, stories like Tameisha's should shake you, they should haunt you, and they should remind you of how fragile trust can be. If you can hear all of this and still hesitate to subscribe to Unraveling Crimes, ask yourself, why? Why ignore the raw truth of humanity's darkest side? Don't let apathy be the reason stories like Tameisha's vanish into silence. Subscribe now, or admit to yourself why you'd rather look away. The night of January 24th was heavy with silence, but behind that silence lurked the sound of betrayal. Tameisha Price never saw it coming. The plan had already been set. Terry Paris and Jerry Scott weren't improvising. This was an execution. A cold, heartless decision to erase Tameisha from the world. The arguments, the accusations, the denials of paternity, it had all built to this horrifying point. We may never know the exact words exchanged in those last moments. Whether Tameisha begged, whether she fought, whether she looked Terry in the eye one last time and asked why. What we do know is that her life was stolen, not by a stranger, not by a passing threat, but by the man she had once loved, the father of her child. And Jerry, his hands weren't clean. He wasn't a bystander. He was part of it, standing shoulder to shoulder with Paris, ensuring that Tameisha never had a chance to walk away. It was brutal. It was final. And it was unforgivable. When the act was done, silence fell. But it wasn't peace. It was the chilling silence of a life extinguished. The kind of silence that seeps into the walls and lingers in the air, long after the crime is over. Tameisha Price, a woman of 36 years, a mother, a protector, was gone. Her body left as a haunting testament to how love twisted into hatred, how responsibility turned into cowardice, and how betrayal can come from the very people closest to you. Her daughter, Tameisha Price, would join her in death just days later, as mother and child were laid to rest side by side on February 3rd. A community wept, a family was shattered, and justice began its slow, painful pursuit. And here's where I ask you, if you can listen to this and still click away without subscribing, what does that say? Stories like Tameisha's deserve to be remembered. They deserve to be heard. If you turn away now, you're letting her voice fade into silence, just as her killers wanted. Don't be that person. Subscribe to Unraveling Crimes, because if you don't, you're choosing to bury the truth all over again. After Tameisha Price was gone, the killers were left with more than blood on their hands. They had to bury the truth. And that's when the cover-up began. Terry Paris and Jerry Scott thought they were clever. They believed that if they erased their tracks, no one would ever know the darkness of what they had done. But murder always leaves shadows, and shadows always find their way to light. The first layer of their deception came from Jerry's girlfriend, Tameisha Price. At 34, she wasn't in the room when Tameisha was murdered, but she became a willing player in the aftermath. When detectives began to ask questions, Triplett provided Jerry with what she thought would be a shield, an alibi. A story designed to place Jerry somewhere else, far from the crime scene. But lies crack under pressure. And when investigators began piecing together timelines, phone records, and witness accounts, that neat little alibi began to crumble. Triplett's story didn't match the facts. She wasn't protecting Jerry's innocence. She was obstructing justice. And that obstruction would eventually land her in handcuffs of her own. Meanwhile, Paris and Jerry moved through their days as though nothing had happened. But the whispers in the community grew louder. The disappearance of Tameisha didn't go unnoticed. Her family, her friends, her neighbors, they knew something was wrong. She was too present, too rooted in her role as a mother to simply vanish. And as police pressed harder, the web of deception grew thinner. Every lie uncovered was another thread pulling the entire cover-up apart. What Paris and Jerry didn't anticipate was this. Covering up a crime requires precision, and neither of them had it. They underestimated investigators. They underestimated the loyalty of the community to Tameisha, and most of all, they underestimated the truth itself. Because no matter how hard you try to bury it, the truth claws its way back to the surface. When Tameisha Price's body was discovered, the shock rippled through her community like a wave crashing against rock. But for investigators, the discovery was only the beginning. Now came the painstaking task of uncovering who had silenced her, and why. From the very first moment, detectives knew something wasn't right. This wasn't a random act of violence. This wasn't a stranger who happened upon her. The brutality, the coldness, the precision, it all pointed inward toward someone she knew. Someone close. They began with the basics. Tameisha's relationships, her family, the father of her unborn child. Quickly, one name surfaced again and again. Terry Paris. The father of her child. The man she had been arguing with. The man who denied responsibility for the baby she carried. As investigators dug deeper, the tension between Tameisha and Paris became clearer. Friends and relatives spoke of their arguments. Neighbors whispered of their rocky relationship. And then came the most chilling detail. Paris had openly questioned the pregnancy, claiming he didn't believe the child was his. That motive was too sharp to ignore. But Paris wasn't alone. Phone records, text messages, and witness accounts began painting a picture of a second man, always hovering in Paris's shadow: Jerry Scott. The loyal friend who was there not to guide Paris away from his darkest thoughts, but to stand beside him in them. The picture was forming, but investigators needed proof. That's when they turned their attention to Tameisha Triplet, Jerry's girlfriend. During questioning, she spun a story, an alibi for Jerry. But her timeline didn't add up. Her answers cracked under the weight of scrutiny. And soon it was clear: she wasn't telling the truth. She wasn't shielding innocence, she was covering for guilt. Piece by piece the puzzle came together. Records placed Paris and Jerry near Tameisha. Their movements betrayed them. Their words to others betrayed them. And Tameisha's false testimony sealed the story of collusion. The net was tightening. What began as suspicion hardened into certainty. Terry Paris was not only responsible, he had planned the murder. Jerry Scott was his accomplice. And Tameisha Triplet had tried to weave a veil of lies to protect them both. The weight of justice was about to come crashing down. Justice moves slowly, but in the case of Tameisha Price, it moved with weight and purpose. After weeks of investigation, after arrests shook the community, the eyes of the public turned to the courtroom, the place where truth would finally be stripped bare. In 2024, both Terry Paris James and Jerry Scott stood before a judge for the first time. Their pleas were firm, cold, and unwavering: not guilty. Not guilty despite the evidence. Not guilty despite the shattered family left in the wake of their crime. Not guilty though the truth hung heavy in the air. The bond was set high, $2 million each. Too high for freedom, too high for escape. Paris and Scott would wait behind bars as their trial loomed, the weight of their decision pressing down with each passing day. Meanwhile, Tameisha Triplet, the woman who had woven lies to protect Jerry, faced her own charges. She posted a $25,000 bond and walked free, though her freedom was temporary, fragile, and shadowed by the role she had played in the cover-up. The courtroom became a stage in 2025, where every detail of the crime was laid bare. Jurors listened. Families wept. The prosecution painted a picture so chilling, it left little doubt. This was not a crime of passion. This was a crime of planning, a crime of intent, a crime that extinguished not one but two lives: Tameisha and her unborn child. By July 2025, the verdict was in. The jury spoke with finality: guilty. Both Paris and Scott were convicted of aggravated murder and related charges. And then came the day that would etch itself into history: July 28, 2025. The judge, with the full weight of justice behind him, delivered a sentence as heavy as the crime itself. 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. For Paris. For Scott. There would be no escape. No chance of release. No second chances. The gavel fell, and with it, the last illusion of freedom for the men who thought they could silence Tameisha forever. When the gavel struck and the sentences were handed down, the courtroom fell silent. But outside those walls, the echoes of Tameisha Price's life carried on, through grief, through memory, through a community forever changed. For her family there was no real victory. Justice had spoken, yes, but it could never bring her back. Her children robbed of their mother. Her relatives robbed of her laughter. Her unborn baby denied the chance to ever take a breath. On February 3, 2024, when both Tameisha and her little daughter Malaysia were laid to rest side by side, the loss became a wound too deep for words. 2 lives gone, a future erased, a void that would never truly heal. Neighbors still speak of her in hushed tones, how she carried herself, how protective she was of her children, how she tried to stand firm in the storm of a toxic relationship. They remember her strength, and they mourn that it wasn't enough to shield her from betrayal so close to home. For the community, her story is a haunting reminder. Evil doesn't always come from strangers in the dark. Sometimes it hides in the people you trust most. The betrayal of Tameisha Price shook everyone who knew her, forcing them to question how love could turn into something so destructive. And yet, in the midst of sorrow, there is resolve. Resolve to keep her memory alive. Resolve to speak her name. Resolve to make sure her story is not forgotten, so that silence does not swallow her twice. Today, when people remember Tameisha, they remember not just the tragedy, but the love she carried for her children, the fight she carried for her dignity, and the life she deserved to keep living. Her legacy is one of caution and remembrance, but also of strength. Because every time her name is spoken, every time her story is told, the world is reminded that behind the headlines was a woman who mattered. A mother. A daughter. A life taken too soon. And so, the story of Tameisha Price doesn't end in that courtroom. It lives on in every tear shed by her family, in every whisper of her name, and in every voice that refuses to let her memory fade. Tameisha Price's story is not just another case file. It is not just another headline lost in the chaos of the news cycle. It is the story of a woman who trusted, who loved, who carried life inside her, only to have that life ripped away by the very people closest to her. Her voice has been silenced. But here on Unraveling Crimes, we make sure her story and stories like hers are never buried. Because silence is what killers want. Silence is what lets their shadows grow. And if we look away, if we stop speaking her name, then we fail her all over again. So I ask you this, will you walk away after hearing this? Will you close this story and let Tameisha's name drift into nothingness? Or will you take a stand right here, right now by hitting subscribe, ensuring her memory and the memory of countless others continues to live on? Every subscription is not just a number. It is a promise. A promise that these victims are not forgotten. A promise that justice continues in the telling. And a promise that you will not be the one who looks away when the truth demands to be heard. The choice is yours. But know this. Those who turn away, those who refuse to keep these stories alive, become part of the silence. And silence is where evil wins. So subscribe to Unraveling Crimes. Because if you don't, then the next time a story like Tameisha's is told, you will have to ask yourself why you chose to stay silent. This has been her story. May Tameisha Price and her daughter Malaysia rest in peace.